As Western audiences have come into contact with Yogacara Buddhism, there has been a consistent, prevailing misunderstanding that Yogacara is somehow a kind of idealist philosophy. That is, a philosophy that prioritizes the perceptions of the mind and purports the ultimate unreality of the perceived world, as it exists only as an experience of the mind. This arises from the consistent declaration within Yogacara Buddhism that the world is unreal or like a dream, and stems from the misunderstanding or unawareness of key foundational ideas of Yogacara Buddhism that differ radically from what Western audiences are commonly exposed to and expect. By understanding what Western idealism is and how its various philosophical ideas relate to Yogacara Buddhism, we can expose the fundamental, irreconcilable differences between these two systems of thought. Western idealism arose in opposition to the prevailing 17th century philosophy of materialism, of which the most notable thinker is John Locke, most commonly known for his contributions to Western liberalism. He argued that material substances have qualities that arise when they are observed, such as color and smell, as well as other qualities that exist even when they are not observed, such as the shape of the substance. These qualities, which depend on an observer, are subjective qualities, as they depend on a viewer's subjective experience and can be different from person to person. For example, one person might look at a rose bush and notice that a flower on the bush is red while its stem is green. Another person, however, who is colorblind, might perceive the color of both the stem and the flower as being red. In both instances, these mental experiences are derived characteristics of the physical objective substance we call a rose bush. Consequently, only that which is physical and mind-independent can ultimately be considered real, and mental phenomenon can always be traced back to an originating physical source. Idealism took this underlying premise of Locke's materialism and turned it on its head, posing itself in direct dialectical opposition to it. Instead of holding that only which is physical is real, as materialism does, idealism argues that only that which is related to the mind is real. The history of Western idealism is one rich with subtle nuances and distinctions, and is hard to generalize about without oversimplifying or misconstruing. This point is compounded by a confusing non-standardization of conventions that often refer to multiple philosophies by the same name, or have multiple contradictory names for the same philosophy. Despite this, Western idealism can be reasonably separated into 5 distinct variations, no matter what these variations happen to be called. The first idealist philosophy to firmly establish itself in the Western tradition of philosophy is that of immaterialism. Through the very construction of the name, immaterialism sets itself up as a philosophical opposite of Locke's materialism. Accordingly, in contrast to Locke's philosophy of metaphysical realism, where all objects exist in a mind-independent way, immaterialism is a philosophy of metaphysical idealism, where the external world and all objects within it exist in a mind-dependent way. Ultimately, all that exists is only made up of mind and consciousness, or something that is related to consciousness. It is this initial premise upon which the philosopher Bishop George Berkeley, often considered the progenitor of Western idealism, establishes his philosophy. Beginning with this initial premise, Berkeley expands and systematizes his philosophy into what is referred to as subjective idealism. He makes the claim that the existence of things depends not just on the mind of a single individual, but on the higher transcendent mind of God. Each individual's consciousness is a transmission down from the consciousness of God, in the same way that many individual TV satellite dishes receive the same information being sent from one big uplink satellite. Unlike Berkeley, it is not ideas concerned with the philosophy of metaphysics, but instead with the philosophy of epistemology that Immanuel Kant concerns himself. Appropriately, Kant's idealism is most often called epistemological idealism, although it also goes by the name phenomenalism, or as Kant himself ambiguously referred to it, transcendental idealism. Kant claims that what we know is not things as they really are, as an epistemological realist would claim, but rather as how they are given to us by our ideas, concepts, and categories. In opposition to Berkeley's foundational idea of immaterialism, where everything that exists is related to mind, Kant instead postulates the ideas of phenomena and noumena. Phenomena, things as they appear to us, are what we perceive conditioned by the concepts and categories we use to organize our experiences. These concepts and categories are innate to our experience of reality, and we cannot step outside of them. Noumena, on the other hand, are things in themselves, or as they really are, and are forever unknowable to us. In this way, Kant makes the distinction that all that we can know is that which is related to mind. For the objective idealists, the first of whom was Johann Gottlieb Fichte, Kant's postulation of noumena opened idealism up to attack by skepticism, as Kant postulates the existence of things that nevertheless cannot be proven to exist. Thusly, objective idealism thus argues against this problematic division of things into the knowable and unknowable by denying the existence of the unknowable altogether, proposing that things depend wholly on a perceiver's mind for their existence without a real unknowable world of noumena for their basis. There is nothing that exists in itself under this philosophical system, only that which exists in the mind of the perceiver. Because of this, objective idealism has also established itself as metaphysical idealism. It is this notion that all subsequent German idealist philosophies are structurally centered upon. Absolute idealism, the final categorization of Western idealism, also agrees with the idea that perception is grounded in nothing except consciousness, but disagrees that this consciousness is human consciousness alone. Of the absolute idealists, of whom Georg Wilhelm Friedrich Hegel and Arthur Schopenhauer are the most notable, there is instead the idea that what ultimately exists is one overarching mental or spiritual force or idea, what Hegel calls the world spirit and Schopenhauer the will. Although this seems similar to Berkeley's subjective idealism, it differs in that Berkeley argues that our perception is derived from God, while for the absolute idealists, all that we perceive is not just derived from a greater force, but in a literal pantheist way is that greater force. With the various forms of Western idealism thus established, Yogacara Buddhism can now be looked at in relation to Western idealism. Coming from the perspective of Western idealism, there are reoccurring misconceptions of Yogacara doctrine that often cause Western audiences to confuse it with immaterial, subjective, objective, and absolute idealism. The Yogacara school is sometimes referred to as the conscious-only school of Buddhism, derived from the Sanskrit word chittamatra, and this can sometimes be misleading. Although the introspective investigation of consciousness is prioritized in Yogacara, even more so than in the other Indian schools of Buddhism, the actual name for the school, Yogacara, means yoga practice, placing an emphasis on Buddhism's meditative aspect. In addition, Western audiences often interpret the idea of conscious only as a metaphysical doctrine of reality, arguing that the only thing that exists is consciousness. This is a fundamentally flawed interpretation, however. In actuality, the idea of conscious only is intended to be an epistemological doctrine, that consciousness is the one knowable fact of the universe, as all other things can be experienced as a co-arising interrelated dependency between the thing and consciousness. Because according to Yogacara, consciousness directs itself at things outside of consciousness, it is categorically false to refer to Chittamatra as a statement of metaphysical idealism, for under metaphysical idealism, all things depend on a perceiver's mind for their existence and do not exist independent of it. This applies to subjective and objective idealism. Although everything extant in Yogacara Buddhism exists in co-arising interrelated dependency, this dependency can exist between things other than consciousness, and consequently can exist outside of consciousness. Furthermore, we are situated within our consciousness's co-arising interrelated dependencies with all other phenomena, and cannot know some greater consciousness or force outside of our own relationship between our consciousness and phenomena, making it impossible for Yogacara to be absolute idealism. Not only is there no way to know or not know a created deity, but in fact, the metaphysical nature of our co-arising dependency does not allow for a greater pantheist force at all, as the interrelatedness of all phenomena and mind doesn't add up to something greater than itself the way a pantheist world spirit would. In fact, it is the complete opposite that is true. Our dependencies, taken together, ultimately add up to emptiness, something that is less than what we conventionally perceive instead of something greater. Finally, in relation to immaterial idealism, Yogacara Buddhism posits that there are three states of reality. These states are addressed in the first two verses of the Triva Sabha Venidesa, as translated by Stefan Annika from the Sanskrit. The constructed, the dependent, and the perfected. These three own beings are the most profound things knowable by the knowledgeable. That which appears is the dependent. How it appears is the constructed. The former develops subject to condition. The latter is construction only.